She was only 11, a little girl with a pink backpack walking up the hill to catch her school bus, just like she did every morning. But that day, something evil was waiting. Within seconds, she was gone. No warning, no goodbye, no trace. What followed was not just a kidnapping, it was a disappearance that would haunt a nation. For 18 years, the world searched, hoping, fearing, forgetting, while she was hidden in plain sight just beyond the backyard fence. This is the horrifying true story of Jaycee Dugard, a child stolen from the street, and the extraordinary path to her rescue nearly 2 decades later. It started like any other school morning. 11-year-old Jaycee Dugard kissed her mother goodbye. She was wearing her favorite pink windbreaker and carrying a bag filled with school books and homework. It was early, the air was cool, and the sky clear as she walked up the steep hill from her house in Myers, a small, peaceful community nestled in the Sierra Nevada mountains. She was just a 5th grader, a quiet, gentle girl, artistic, thoughtful, sensitive. She loved animals and drawing and had dreams like any kid her age. Her mom, Terry Probin, had recently remarried, and Jaycee was adjusting to life with her stepfather, Carl Probin. The family had only moved to the area a year earlier. Jaycee was just minutes away from her bus stop when a gray car pulled up behind her. It was about 7:45 a.m. Inside the car were 2 strangers, Philip Garrido, a convicted sex offender out on parole, and his wife, Nancy Garrido. They had been watching the neighborhood. They weren't lost. They weren't driving by, they were hunting. Nancy, the passenger, rolled down her window and pretended to ask for directions. Before Jaycee could respond, Philip jumped out with a stun gun. He zapped her in the neck. She collapsed, convulsing on the gravel. Before anyone could see, Nancy opened the door, dragged Jaycee's tiny body into the back seat, and slammed it shut. The car sped off. Just like that, in under a minute, Jaycee Dugard was gone. Her stepfather Carl was looking out the window from inside the house. He saw the car stop. He saw a struggle. He saw the vehicle speed away, but he couldn't see the license plate clearly enough. He dropped everything and jumped on his mountain bike, desperately chasing the car down the street. But it was too late. They were gone. He rushed back and called 911.
This is 911.
My daughter was just kidnapped. Top of the hill was a gray Ford. A man and a woman in the car.
Within hours, police set up roadblocks. Helicopters were deployed. Jaycee's face was on the news the same day. Posters blanketed the region. Her family was frantic, shaken, devastated. They begged the public for help. But the case went cold faster than anyone could have imagined. There were no cameras, no usable eyewitnesses, no plate number, no clues. Jaycee had vanished without a trace. News of the abduction sent shockwaves through South Lake Tahoe. Children were kept home from school. Parents refused to let kids walk alone. The bright forested town, once seen as safe, suddenly felt sinister. Local and national media covered the story relentlessly in the first few weeks. But without any leads, the attention began to fade. Weeks turned into months, months into years. And all that time, Jaycee was alive, just 120 miles away. Terry, Jaycee's mother, refused to give up. She became a tireless advocate for missing children. She kept a photo of Jaycee on her dresser every day. She kept her daughter's room exactly the same. She participated in every interview, spoke at vigils, and clung to the hope that her child might still come home. Meanwhile, suspicions and rumors swirled around Carl, the stepfather. Some believed his story didn't add up. Others questioned how a man could see a kidnapping and not do more. But police never charged him with anything. And later, Jaycee herself would vindicate him, saying she saw him trying to save her. Still, for the family, that suspicion was salt in a gaping wound. No body, no evidence, no goodbye, just absence. At the exact same time, 11-year-old Jaycee woke up chained to a bed inside a windowless shed in Antioch, California. Her captors, Philip and Nancy Garrido, were not finished with her, not even close. The story that would unfold in that backyard over the next 18 years is one of the darkest and most chilling cases of child abduction in history, not only because of the evil committed, but because of how long it lasted, right under society's nose. When the car carrying 11-year-old Jaycee Dugard finally stopped, the nightmare had only just begun. She was driven nearly 120 miles away to a faded yellow house in Antioch, California. The neighborhood looked ordinary, Rows of homes, kids on bikes, sprinklers watering front lawns. But behind one of those homes was hell. Behind the Garridos' house stood a backyard compound. It was sealed off by fences, tarps, and shrubs. It looked like nothing more than storage junk, maybe a tool shed or a covered workspace. But inside, it was something far more sinister, a secret prison. Jaycee was pulled from the car, still dazed from the stun gun, and dragged into a soundproof shed. The walls were lined with insulation, the door locked from the outside. There were no windows, no light, no escape. She would not step outside those fences for 18 years. Jaycee was handcuffed to a bed. Her captor, Philip Garrido, visited regularly, sometimes acting like a kind father figure, sometimes like a religious zealot, and often like a predator. He called her Angel. He told her God had chosen her for him. He brought her fast food. He gave her coloring books. He told her they were starting a new life together. But beneath his delusion, there was only one goal: control. Jaycee didn't understand what was happening. She cried for her mother. She waited, thinking the police would come. She didn't even know where she was. They told her to stop using her real name. She was now Alyssa. If she ever spoke her real name again, there would be consequences. And over time, her voice began to disappear. The abuse wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Jaycee wasn't allowed to watch TV, read the news, or even know the date. The Garridos controlled her thoughts, her surroundings, her identity. She was given kittens at one point, small companions in her lonely prison. But when she grew too attached to them, they mysteriously vanished. She wasn't told she had missed birthdays, that her classmates had graduated, that people were still searching. Philip Garrido would take methamphetamine, then rant for hours about God and angels. Sometimes he would make Jaycee listen to his hallucinations. He believed he had divine powers. He would preach to her, record tapes of his messages, and force her to sit and listen for hours. His wife, Nancy, was no better. She was cold, controlling, and complicit. She monitored Jaycee. She brought her food. She reinforced the lie that no one was looking for her, that her mother had forgotten her. Years passed this way, slow, dark, and endless. As Jaycee grew older, the backyard compound grew larger. Garrido added tents, storage units, and makeshift buildings to house her, and later, her daughters. Blue tarps covered everything from overhead, blocking even the sky. To any outsider, it looked like trash, but for Jaycee, it became her world. She never saw a doctor, never went to school, never left. The Garridos went about their lives in the front of the house, hosting parole officers, attending church, walking through the neighborhood, while Jaycee was locked away just yards behind them, and no one ever noticed. Jaycee later said she lost track of how long she'd been there. It felt like forever, she said. There was no clock, no seasons, just survival. She learned not to fight, not to scream, only to endure. In 1994, just 3 years into her captivity, Jaycee gave birth to a baby girl. She was 14 years old, no hospital, no midwife, just her, alone in a shed, in labor. She cut the umbilical cord herself. 3 years later, she gave birth again, another daughter, also fathered by Philip Garrido. She became a mother while still a child, and her daughters, they grew up believing that Garrido was their father, and Jaycee was their older sister. Despite the trauma, Jaycee tried to create a sense of normalcy for her children. She taught them how to read, how to draw. She made up bedtime stories. She created a classroom in one of the tents using scrap paper and old books. They played in the backyard, never knowing that freedom was just beyond the fence. Jaycee tried to shield them from the worst parts of their reality. She made the compound feel like a home, because there was no other choice. This was their life now. What no one knew was that Jaycee Dugard, once the most searched for missing child in America, was right there in the open. Philip Garrido was visited by parole officers 60 times while Jaycee was in captivity. Not once did they check the backyard. Not once did they find her. Years went by. 2 girls grew up. Jaycee aged from a child into a woman, all behind tarps, beneath trees, beside a monster. The world had forgotten her. But that would change, thanks to one moment of strange behavior, and one security guard who trusted her gut. For most of Jaycee Dugard's captivity, she lived just steps away from the front yard and just inches from being rescued. But time after time, the people tasked with finding her, or even just checking up on her captor, missed the signs. These weren't subtle hints. This wasn't an impossible mystery. This was a failure of oversight, a tragedy of inaction, and a sobering example of how bureaucracy can bury the truth. Philip Garrido was a registered sex offender. He had served prison time for a brutal 1976 kidnapping and rape. After being released on parole, he was supposed to be monitored closely. Instead, he became one of the most disturbing case studies of how parole supervision can go dangerously wrong. Between 1991 and 2009, Garrido was visited by parole officers more than 60 times. They knocked on his door, they checked paperwork, they even walked around the property. But they never looked closely enough. The backyard compound, where Jaycee was being held prisoner with her 2 daughters, was technically off limits, hidden behind fences, cluttered with tarps and junk that looked like abandoned storage. No one ever asked what was back there. No one demanded to see for themselves. There were clues, many of them. In 2006, a neighbor called 911 to report that tents and people were living in Garrido's backyard and that the man was a known sex offender. Police were dispatched. They knocked on the front door. Philip answered. He was polite. He said it was just his family. The officer never asked to go around the house. He never saw Jaycee. The call was closed without investigation. In another instance, Garrido was visited by his parole agent after installing soundproofing in a shed. The parole officer noted it in his report, saying it looked suspicious. But again, nothing was done. Jaycee was behind that wall, listening, waiting. One of the most painful missed opportunities came when a parole officer spotted a blonde girl in the backyard in the early 2000s. She looked young. She didn't speak. When asked who she was, Garrido claimed she was his niece. No identification was requested. No further questions were asked. The girl was Jaycee's daughter, born in captivity. Once again, the opportunity to uncover the truth was missed. By the late 1990s, Jaycee Dugard's case had grown cold. Her posters had come down. The news stopped covering her disappearance. Her name faded from national memory. Only her mother, Terry Probin, and a few dedicated advocates still fought for answers. Terry appeared at missing persons events, held candlelight vigils, and pushed for better tracking of sex offenders. But the public had moved on. As far as most people were concerned, Jaycee was either dead or unfindable. The idea that she was living in a suburban backyard, raising 2 children in captivity, was simply too unthinkable. In her memoir, A Stolen Life, Jaycee wrote that she would often hear visitors outside the compound. She'd hear voices, footsteps. Once she heard children laughing on the other side of the fence. She longed to scream, to cry for help. But Garrido had conditioned her to believe that no one would help and that trying to escape would only bring more punishment, or worse. So she stayed silent. She protected her daughters. She endured. Every knock on the door was a chance for freedom, and every missed opportunity a deeper wound. In hindsight, investigators described the case as a catastrophic breakdown of the parole system. Garrido was not only allowed to move freely, he was given too much trust, even after multiple parole violations and complaints. The oversight reports were later reviewed and rewritten. Officers were fired, policy reforms were introduced. But none of that would give back the years Jaycee had lost. How could this happen? The Garridos played the part of normal citizens perfectly. Their front yard was neat. Philip held religious meetings. He launched a printing business and even filed patents for inventions he created. He spoke with calm, almost robotic politeness. Nancy stayed in the background. The house was quiet. No screams, no chaos, no broken windows. It wasn't until one person trusted their instinct that the truth was finally revealed. But before that happened, Jaycee's life continued in secret. One day blurred into the next. No birthdays, no holidays, just survival. Jaycee Dugard's body had begun to change, but no one explained why. There were no nurses, no school health classes, no motherly talks, only pain, confusion, and fear. She was just a 14-year-old girl, locked in a backyard compound, and now pregnant. For years, Philip Garrido had used her as a pawn in his twisted delusions. He said she was special. He told her angels had brought them together. He called her his wife, though she was still just a child. Jaycee didn't know what was happening at first. Her stomach grew, her body ached, but no one said the word pregnant. No one prepared her for what was coming. She wasn't offered a hospital. She wasn't given a doctor. She wasn't even given comfort. Philip's wife, Nancy Garrido, stood by, knowing what was happening, and did nothing. The day came in 1994, 3 years after Jaycee's abduction. Jaycee went into labor in the small, filthy shed she'd called home for far too long. It was sweltering, suffocating. She was alone for most of it, gripping on to whatever she could for strength. The pain was indescribable, but Jaycee didn't scream. She couldn't. She had learned silence was survival. She gave birth without aid, without anesthesia, without reassurance. And then, after hours of agony, a tiny cry filled the darkness. A baby girl, her daughter, was now in her arms. Jaycee was a mother at 14. What followed was not maternal joy. It was survival, responsibility, and grief. Jaycee now had another soul to protect, another innocent life growing up in captivity. She wasn't allowed to call herself Mom. She was instructed to go by the name Alyssa. Garrido told the child to call him Daddy. He pretended they were a family. He believed he was building something holy. Jaycee knew better, but she nodded, she complied. She played the role because defiance could mean pain, or worse. Still, something stirred inside her. She now had a reason to live. In 1997, it happened again. Jaycee became pregnant a second time, at just 17. Again, there was no medical care, no hospital, no midwife. Only trauma, filth, and silence. She delivered another daughter, alone in the same shack, using only what she had seen on TV and in books Garrido allowed. She cleaned the baby herself. She wrapped her. She made space in the compound for a crib. And once again, she was told she could not be called Mother. But in her heart, that's all she was. Philip Garrido's delusions intensified after the children were born. He believed they were a divine blessing, proof that he was chosen by God. He thought his compound was the beginning of a new spiritual society. He began calling it God's kingdom. Jaycee became the central figure in his fantasy. And through it all, Nancy Garrido, the woman who helped abduct Jaycee, cared for the babies occasionally, but never lifted a finger to help Jaycee escape. She remained a silent enabler, feeding the lie, watching a stolen childhood unfold. As the girls grew, the compound expanded. Garrido added tents, partitions, and new sheds. To the outside world, it looked like junk piled up in a messy backyard. But inside, it was all Jaycee and her daughters had. They had never seen a school, never walked in a park, never tasted pizza or ridden a bike. Jaycee tried to give them a world, even within those fences. She made games. She taught them to read. She told bedtime stories. She painted their tiny faces with leftover makeup. She made birthdays feel real, even if they weren't celebrated on the right day. She gave them hope, even when she had none left for herself. Despite the horrors of her reality, Jaycee never gave up on her daughters. She said later, "They were born into darkness, but they were the light that saved me." She made up holidays, invented words, created fairy tales. She taught them love in a place where love wasn't supposed to exist. She wasn't raising them in a home, she was raising them in a prison. But still, they smiled, they learned, they laughed, because she made sure they never saw the evil that created them. While Jaycee raised her daughters in captivity, the outside world kept turning. The girls who were born in that backyard didn't know who they were. And Jaycee, the girl stolen from her mother, never got to be a kid again. Still, she found a way to survive, and not just survive, but care, nurture, and protect. She had built a life out of nothing, all while being told her real name didn't matter. But soon, a stranger would look her in the eyes and ask her the one question no one had asked in 18 years. "What's your name?" It had been 18 years, 18 birthdays missed, 18 summers never seen, 18 years of silence, fear, and survival. But in August 2009, a chain of events began that would finally crack the cage Jaycee Dugard had lived in for nearly 2 decades. It started with something small, something ordinary, something Garrido had done before without consequence. But this time, someone paid attention. Philip Garrido, now in his 50s, brought 2 young girls with him to the University of California, Berkeley campus. He claimed he was interested in hosting a religious event on the grounds and wanted to speak to someone in charge. The girls with him were barefoot. They were dressed oddly. They didn't make eye contact. They barely spoke. The woman they approached was Lisa Campbell, a UC Berkeley campus security specialist. Something about Garrido's behavior sent up red flags. He was talking in circles, rambling about God and spiritual powers. But it wasn't just Garrido, it was the girls. They looked out of place, not just shy, but sheltered, confused, caged. Campbell trusted her gut. She alerted her supervisor, who ran a background check. The name Philip Garrido lit up the screen with flashing warnings. Registered sex offender, prior convictions, on lifetime parole. UC Berkeley contacted Garrido's parole officer, who, shockingly, had no idea Garrido had any children living with him. This was a massive violation of his parole terms. The next day, Garrido was summoned to the parole office in Concord, California. He arrived with the 2 girls and a woman. She had long, matted blonde hair. She wore ill-fitting clothes. She looked fragile, age beyond her years. She called herself Alyssa. She said the girls were her children, that Garrido was a good man, that everything was fine. But investigators knew something was off. They separated her from Garrido and started asking questions. And then, for the first time in 18 years, the truth came out. "I'm Jaycee." At first she lied. It wasn't defiance, it was habit. She had spent most of her life being told that her real name could get her killed, that the world had forgotten her, that no one would believe her. But the agents were gentle, patient. They promised her safety. They promised to listen. After hours of questioning, her voice shook, her hands trembled, and then she said it. "I'm Jaycee Dugard." The room fell silent. Parole agents were stunned. Federal officers were called in. The FBI arrived. The story was almost too impossible to believe. The girl who vanished in 1991 was alive. She had been hidden in a backyard compound less than 2 hours from her home for 18 years. Authorities moved quickly. They raided the Garrido home in Antioch. They discovered the maze of sheds, tents, tarps, and fences behind the house. They found evidence of Jaycee's presence, of her daughter's lives, and of the years of isolation and control. Neighbors were stunned. Some said they'd seen the girls playing outside. One even said, "I thought they were just visiting relatives." No one ever imagined they were looking at children born in captivity. Philip and Nancy Garrido were arrested immediately, charged with multiple counts, including kidnapping, rape, false imprisonment, child endangerment. When questioned, Garrido rambled about hearing voices. He claimed Jaycee had been part of God's plan. He never showed remorse. Nancy remained largely silent, but her role was undeniable. She had helped abduct Jaycee. She had watched the abuse. She had done nothing to stop it. Back at the parole office, Jaycee was given a phone. For the first time in 18 years, she heard her mother's voice. Terry Probin collapsed to the ground when she heard the words, "Hi, Mom, it's me, it's Jaycee." They sobbed together. Terry later said that no words could describe what that moment felt like. Her baby was alive. Her daughter was coming home. When the news broke, it shocked the nation. People were stunned, overwhelmed, furious. How could someone so wanted be missing for so long? How could parole officers have visited Garrido dozens of times and never found her? The media flooded Antioch. Helicopters buzzed overhead. Jaycee and her daughters were rushed into protective custody and kept far from the spotlight. The focus was now on healing, but justice was still to come. When Jaycee Dugard spoke her real name for the first time in nearly 2 decades, the walls of silence finally crumbled. The world now knew she had survived. 2 daughters had been born in captivity, and for 18 long years, a known sex offender had hidden her in plain sight. But survival was only the beginning. Now came the reckoning. In the days following Jaycee's dramatic reappearance in August 2009, law enforcement descended on Philip and Nancy Garrido's Antioch home. What they found was horrifying. Tents, sheds, a windowless soundproof box where Jaycee had first been kept, play areas where her daughters had grown up, never knowing anything beyond those backyard fences. There was no question. This was a crime scene. The Garridos were charged with over 24 felony counts, including kidnapping, rape, false imprisonment, child endangerment, sexual assault, production of child pornography. Bail was set at $30 million each. Both pleaded not guilty at first. Jaycee didn't appear in the courtroom. She didn't need to. She had spent enough of her life in the presence of monsters. She refused to sit across from them again, this time by choice. Instead, she submitted a written statement that was later read aloud in court. In it, she said, "I chose not to waste another second of my life in their presence. They stole my name, my life, my body, but they cannot take my future." Those words echoed through the courtroom like a thunderclap. This wasn't just about punishment. It was about reclaiming power. Prosecutors began building a timeline of the Garridos' crimes. They presented evidence of Jaycee's handwritten journals documenting years of abuse, DNA results confirming Garrido fathered both daughters, surveillance photos of the compound, testimonies from parole officers, neighbors, and UC Berkeley staff, psychiatric evaluations showing Garrido's long-standing delusions. But the case was airtight even before the first exhibit was introduced. The very existence of Jaycee and her daughters, alive, traumatized, but free, was proof enough. Faced with overwhelming evidence, the defense shifted. In April 2011, both Garridos changed their pleas to guilty. Philip Garrido, the man who had stalked, stolen, raped, and imprisoned a child, was sentenced to 431 years to life in prison. His wife and accomplice, Nancy Garrido, was sentenced to 36 years to life. Neither would ever see freedom again. The courtroom was quiet when the verdict was read. No cheering, no outbursts. Only a shared sense of solemn justice, decades in the making. Though Nancy Garrido never physically assaulted Jaycee, the court determined that her role in the abduction and her complete inaction during 18 years of abuse made her fully complicit. She was the one who helped kidnap Jaycee. She was the one who locked her away. She cooked for her, watched her give birth, lied to her face, pretended to be a caregiver, but never once tried to stop it. The court concluded that her silence made her just as dangerous. After the sentencing, a new round of questions exploded in the media. How could this happen for so long? Why didn't parole officers check the backyard? How many times had Garrido been within reach of exposure and been let go? A massive internal review of the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation followed. At least 2 officers were fired, others were demoted or retrained. Statewide policies changed. Jaycee's case became a case study in systemic failure and a turning point for how parolees, especially sex offenders, would be monitored going forward. Though she remained private, Jaycee released another public statement following the sentencing. "I'm not ashamed of what happened to me. I survived. I became a mother. I found strength I didn't know I had. I'm still healing, but I'm not hiding anymore." Those words didn't just reclaim her identity. They empowered survivors everywhere. Jaycee Dugard was no longer just a missing child. She was a voice, a warrior, a woman who outlived her captors and outlasted the silence. With the Garridos behind bars, Jaycee could finally begin a new chapter of her life, a chapter without fences or fear. But healing is not linear. There's no sentencing strong enough to undo 18 years of stolen time. There is no justice that returns a childhood. Still, the courtroom had spoken. Philip Garrido would die in prison. Nancy Garrido would never be free. And Jaycee, she was finally home. 18 years in captivity. 18 years of silence. And then, the world knew her name. Jaycee Lee Dugard. Not the ghost of a missing girl, not just a headline, but a survivor who had endured the unimaginable and lived to tell the truth. And now, her greatest chapter was just beginning. After the Garridos were arrested and sentenced, Jaycee was reunited with her mother, Terry Probin, and her half-sister, Shayna. They hadn't seen her since she was 11 years old. The moment they embraced was not filmed. No cameras, no interviews, just a mother holding her daughter for the first time in 18 years. Jaycee didn't return to a media frenzy. She returned to quiet, privacy, and rebuilding. She moved to a secure location with her daughters and her family, surrounded by counselors, legal support, and trauma specialists. She had to learn the world all over again. Jaycee had missed more than a decade of modern life. She had never sent a text message, never gone to high school, never driven a car. Now she was navigating grocery stores, using the internet, learning how to be free, all while raising 2 daughters born in confinement. Her older daughter was 15, the younger 12. They had never been in a classroom. They had never known another child. They didn't even know that the outside world had been looking for their mother. Jaycee didn't just teach them how to live in the world. She had to learn with them. And she did it with grace, courage, and resilience. In 2011, Jaycee released her memoir, A Stolen Life. It was raw, brave, unfiltered. In it, she described the abuse, the isolation, the births of her daughters, and the psychological torment inflicted by the Garridos. She spoke about how she survived by escaping into her imagination, how she protected her children from the truth, and how she had never stopped hoping to be found. The book became a #1 New York Times bestseller, but it wasn't written for fame. It was written for healing. Jaycee later said, "Telling my story helped me take back my power. It reminded me that I'm not just what happened to me, I'm what I choose to become." In 2016, Jaycee released a second book, titled Freedom, My Book of Firsts. It chronicled her experiences after being rescued. Her first time ordering coffee, her first visit to the beach, her first panic attack in a crowded room, her daughter's first days in school. The little victories most people take for granted for Jaycee were milestones. Her voice was calm, composed, and full of hope. Wanting to help others who'd experienced trauma, Jaycee founded the JAYC Foundation, short for Just Ask Yourself to Care. The nonprofit provides support to families recovering from abduction, abuse, and severe trauma. It offers therapy programs, family reunification services, and trauma-informed care. Jaycee's message is clear. Healing isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about learning how to live with it and live well. Her foundation partners with law enforcement and mental health professionals to change the way survivors are treated, not as victims, but as people regaining control of their lives. Though Jaycee rarely seeks media attention, she has appeared in select interviews, including with Diane Sawyer, where she shared her story in her own words. She speaks calmly. She doesn't break down. She doesn't flinch. Her presence is quiet but powerful. She refuses to be defined by what was done to her. She chooses instead to define herself by what she's become: a mother, a survivor, a fighter. Jaycee doesn't pretend the pain is gone. There are still days when the past catches up to her. There are still questions she'll never have answers to. There are still years that can never be replaced. But she has built something stronger than justice. She has built peace. Her daughters are thriving. Her family is whole. And her voice, once silenced, is now a source of strength for survivors around the world. Jaycee Dugard was taken at 11. She was found at 29, but she refuses to let those 18 years define her. She says, "I want people to know, I am not broken, I am not ashamed, I am more than what happened to me." And maybe that's the real story here. Not just the horror of what was lost, but the power of what was found. If you made it this far, thank you for listening to Jaycee's story. Let her strength be a reminder. Never stop paying attention. Never stop asking questions. And never, ever stop believing that survival is possible. Subscribe to my channel for more true crime stories that deserve to be told. Share your thoughts in the comments, and always support survivors' voices.